Welcome everybody to Week, the political roundtable from the Commonwealth Club of California from Monday, August 21st, 2017. We will, of course, be spending a good portion of today's program talking about the events at and the implications of Charlottesville. For his part, late-night comedian Seth Meyers had this to say about Trump's press conference in which Trump gave an impromptu defense of the white nationalist rally. Quote, Normally, when someone is talking that level of crazy, Batman crashes through the ceiling and punches him. Trump is like a bad waitress at a crappy diner who's trying to get fired so she can go to a concert, unquote. Well, I'm not a bad waitress, but I am your host for Week and the Commonwealth Club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. On today's program, of course, we're going to discuss Charlottesville, the responses to it, the impending far-right rallies right here in the Bay Area, the latest musical chairs at the White House senior staff level, as well as some other political news, and we'll wrap it all up with our live news quiz. I always note that the Commonwealth Club is a place for people with a wide range of views, so any opinions that are expressed here are those solely of the speakers and not of the Commonwealth Club. Now, I would like to note that we'll be discussing a number of issues tonight having to do with diversity, and I know you're all looking up there and saying you've got a platform full of men. This is true. This is somehow just how scheduling and availability works out. For what it's worth, and first of all, I'm very pleased to have all three of these folks back on our panel, but as it turns out, our next panel will in fact be all women. So, plus me. I mean, I'll be there to mansplain everything, but anyway, let's meet our panelists for tonight. I'm going to start on the far end of the stage with Dan Borenstein. He's a columnist and editorial writer for the East Bay Times, and he's on Twitter at BorensteinDan. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
Next to him is Martin G. Reynolds. He's the co-executive director of the Robert C. Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. He's the director of the Reveal Investigative Fellowships at the Center for Investigative Reporting, and he's also on Twitter at Reynolds Post. So welcome back, Martin. And next to me is Dr. James Taylor, the Director of African American Studies and a Professor of Political Science at the University of San Francisco. He's on Twitter at
OOTTIE.
Udi, that's right. Welcome back, James.
Hey, thank you.
Now, you know, there are question cards spread throughout the room, so please write down some questions. We'll have people pick them up and deliver them to me, and I will try to ask as many as we can during our program today. So, let's get on to the big topic. And it's definitely an ongoing story. A little more than a week ago, a group of white nationalists, the Klan, neo-Nazis, and others, basically the entire basket of deplorables, held a march and rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is a fairly liberal college town in the southern state of Virginia. They were there ostensibly to protest the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Now, they were met by a large number of counter-protesters, and as we all know, at one point, a man drove a car into a group of the counter-protesters, killing one woman and injuring dozens of others. Now, while those events were troubling enough, it all quickly became a self-inflicted political injury, if you will, for the president, who first offered comments that appeared to equate the white nationalists and the counter-protesters. A couple days later, he made that famous teleprompter speech, which some likened to a hostage video, and only to undercut it the next day when he, again, equated the two sides and even said that both sides had, quote, very fine people, unquote. The reaction has been dramatic. It's been from both sides of the aisle. James, you're right next to me, so let's start with you. And let's first talk about Charlottesville, what actually happened there. I mean, was that rally, that collection of however we want to describe them, white nationalists, some hate groups according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, is this a normal activity for them, or was this a step up or something different in quality?
I think that's a great question. I think it's the normal politics that they have articulated and promoted and promulgated for decades. But what we have now is almost a perfect storm that has allowed them to mainstream what had for decades and even longer been marginalized political and social and even cultural opinions. But with the president and his cabinet and administration sort of making it known that they have no real opposition to support from these elements, at least in terms of the campaign that we just experienced, and now through a governing strategy, it seems like it's real. And Donald Trump is sort of turned the adage that I've heard for the past 8 years, where people said repeatedly that Barack Obama is not the president of Black America, Barack Obama is the president of all America, and that came mostly from Black Americans criticizing other Black Americans who said Barack Obama needs to pay more attention to his loyal constituents. Both George Bush and Donald Trump have shown that they are committed to their constituents, and Barack Obama wasn't. And yet, again, people said Barack Obama's not the president of only a small strata of Americans. He has to be the president of all Americans. And yet, within 6 months of Barack Obama's removal, we have a president who's turned that completely on its head, and is only focusing on a very narrow strata of the electorate altogether, with success. And that's the troubling part.
Yeah, Martin, what do you think? Is this different in kind?
Well, I mean, I think what troubles me most when I think about this, and we had a great show this week with Reveal with Al Letson, who had talked a lot about this, and I also saw on other media where it talked about how there's a gentleman by the name of Douglas Blackman, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and talked about how that the selection of Charlottesville was really quite intentional, in fact, because in doing so, it's a smaller college town, and there was an expectation, according to him, that the folks that these people would run into would be other white liberals, right? Mm-hmm. That they didn't, other cities like Dallas, like New Orleans, which has recently taken down Confederate monuments, they didn't go there. Yeah. Had they gone there, the reality is that they probably would have faced more African Americans in that protest, right? And what his contention was that they were seeking to deracialize the conflict and to make it seem as though this is about patriotism, not about racism.
That's right.
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly we're seeing with the white nationalist movement a little bit, they've become more sophisticated. I mean, right. let's be, the days of the robes are gone, right. For the most part.
It was polo shirts and chinos.
Yeah, it was polo shirts and chinos.
I mean, seriously.
Exactly. They've become much more sophisticated. And we've seen it in Berkeley, and we're going to see it in Berkeley and San Francisco next weekend, probably. And the question is, how do you react to it? How does the public react to it? How do most people who, in my opinion, most right-thinking people react to this sort of abhorrent message? And what they got last week is what they wanted. Right. They got media attention. They got engagement. They got conflict. Which raises a much bigger question, which is, how do you react? I wrote a column last week that got a lot of controversial reaction. It stirred up, in which I basically said, don't engage, don't fall into the trap. Because what they want more than anything else is to have engagement that generates publicity. They control the message, and that is the best recruiting tool they could hope for. Yeah. I think falling into that trap would be really horrible. And I fear what will happen this coming weekend here in the Bay Area.
Right, and I think you have to look at Boston this past weekend. I think Boston shows a good example. Like San Francisco, Boston has been on the forefront of opposition to Trump at the local level and these forces. And yesterday, apparently, less than 100 people for these elements showed up in support of Nazism, et cetera. And you had 20,000, mostly white people in Boston. A city that has largely been regarded as one of the more racist cities in the country, to show out full force. Now, there are others who are there locally who are saying that the liberals in Boston need to also check their racism as well. And it's not just about SWAT stickers and Nazi signs that we should be responding to, but everyday quotidian, pedestrian, institutional and structural racisms that people who otherwise are good, well-intended people allow to persist in our society. So I think, it's one thing to respond to the KKK's kind of overt racism or Donald Trump's unredeemed performances so far, irredeemable performances so far. It's another thing to get at everyday realities.
Well, do you think, though, by making it by it being a very explicit neo-Nazis one side, white liberals on the other, that it perhaps makes those white liberals less likely to question their own?
I think so. I mean, I think if you see an extreme example of what you are, you don't focus on you. You say, look at that, right? And that's how this has persisted.
Yeah.
But we don't have time to enumerate all of the ways, in everyday way, ordinary ways, in which Donald Trump is simply, to me, the tipping point of a reaction to the way in which Barack Obama's election had launched in this whole perception of a post-racial new reality. And then the backlash against that is what we're in the midst of. And we're in an intense, historic backlash, precedented only by the likes of the backlash to Reconstruction in the form of Jim Crow. So we are in, I think, a historically significant moment that there are things that young people are experiencing now in these streets that Martin Luther King and his generation could not deal with and never had to deal with, that require sort of new narratives in talking about these movements and efforts to address these issues.
James, I'm really curious. How would you suggest that most people react to this? You know, and I totally understand what you're saying about the the inner soul searching, if you will, but also outwardly. This weekend, for example, what would you say? How should the masses, if you will, of right-thinking people in the liberal Bay Area, how should they react to that?
I think just through the force of their presence. I mean, the numbers, the demonstration, the outpouring. What we've seen Donald Trump do very forcefully and effectively is also unify and democratize elements of the society that had not been mobilized for a long time. Many women responded and have stayed engaged ever since January that had not been engaged in the political process before. And many people across the board, I think, are responding in these ways. And so I think just showing up as 20,000 silent observers in Boston to say, we don't know exactly how to deal with this issue that's before us, but we are here to say we know that is wrong, and that had a powerful effect.
I totally agree with you, but I would add, I think the key to it is to keep it peaceful, because you know, and I don't know if you agree with this, and I'm curious, you know, but to me, if you engage it, if it becomes a violent protest, it plays right into the Trumpian hand.
I think so. Whereas in the 60s, it played into Martin Luther King in the civil rights.
Right, exactly.
Democratic progressive.
It's flipped now.
It flips now because Trump is, I think it's because the bar is so low for Trump that anyone attempting to engage him at the level of these kind of guttural cultural politics is bound to come down to his level.
Exactly.
As opposed to him as president asking us all to rise to a certain level that we were historically expected.
But you know, I think what stands out to me also, when you're looking at it from the perspective of a journalist, is when I watch him say what he said about how, even in this speech this evening about Afghanistan, about how racism is bad and putting it in these very simple terms. In fact, the actions of this administration are counter to that. One of the guests that Al Letson had on Reveal this week, a radio show, the Center of Investigative Reporting, was talking about his organization called Life After Hate. It's an organization that helps white supremacists who want to walk away from this world. And he interviewed one of the co-founders, Christian Piccolini, who himself was a skinhead back in Chicago. And then later on, after getting into a violent confrontation with a young African-American man and kicking him and beating him and actually looking up and seeing his eyes, and they connected for that one moment, he realized that he needed to get out of that. And then he made a huge change in his life and then co-founded this organization, which helps people who are these white nationalists who want to step away from this violence, step away from this world. And one of the things that he had pointed out was that you rarely change someone's mind when you punch them in the face. So I do think this notion that we have to look at racists sort of, you know, angrily is problematic. The other part that he also talked about, which was really interesting, was he talked about the organization. They just were awarded a $400,000 grant before Obama left office. Lo and behold, they applied to Homeland Security and were awarded it to do more of this work. Lo and behold, when Trump went into office, that grant was rescinded. There was a series of grants that were issued, and of all of the grants that were rescinded, theirs was the only one, and they were the only organization that focused on white extremism. So when Trump talks about that he views this badly, and these speeches, right, that you go from teleprompter to actually real Trump, then back to teleprompter to real Trump. The reality is journalists have to call that because the actions of the administration are actually running counter to the very claims that he's making in speeches like that.
Let me ask. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, you know, Martin, I heard that podcast, by the way. It's really excellent. I encourage people give it a listen. What was also really interesting about that podcast was his description of the white nationalists, the Nazi group, and what you quickly realize is the difficulty of getting out. It's like being in a gang.
Yeah.
And once in,
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to get out. And to me, that was a real eye opener of sort of the mentality within, the constraints of movement, and so that reaching people like that is not only do you not want to physically engage them,
Right.
but the problem is understanding that some of them may be trapped in this, and the last thing we want to do is put up physical warlike walls that just drive them deeper into this.
See, I'm not persuaded that they can be converted.
I'm not persuaded.
Bernie Sanders people keep trying to get these people to align themselves, and I think it betrays a profound, lack of appreciation for the deep way in which racial polarization is deeply ingrained in American politics in terms of our party system alone. The entire party system is easily explainable by race. Nothing else explains American parties for 200 years or a little bit less better than race. Nothing. Not gender, not sexuality, not region, not income, not wealth. Nothing but race explains racial political parties in America. The liberals, the Democrats changed their names in 1932 to 64, changed the names of which party is conservative, which party is liberal. Liberalism and conservatism stay in the American party system in that box, and they both are shaped by where is the Negro, where is the working class white. And then they choose and have continued to choose which between these two elements. And even today, bringing up Colin Kaepernick here in San Francisco, the NFL has made that choice. When it has decided, for example, to bring Hank Williams back as a symbol for bringing on the broadcast on Monday Night Football, it's saying culturally that we are ignoring the African Americans who are concerned about what Colin Kaepernick is trying to articulate, and also what Hank Williams represents was this sort of appeal to the NASCAR working class element of whites that our party and political system has had a difficult time historically bringing together. Even the socialists, the Marxists in America have failed at bringing the white working class hillbilly cultural element together with the working class element of African Americans. So it's failed across the board, and to think that we're going to get some new religion suddenly to change this after 150 years, where these people identify themselves based on the hate of blacks specifically, not racism, anti-black sentiment specifically, and all of the polls show that Donald Trump's support has a strong anti-black effect.
Okay. James, I don't think.
Oh, Dan, go.
I don't think I agree with you. Okay, but I don't think you're going to change these people's minds. I agree. What I think you don't want to do is give them a rallying cause to build their numbers.
But you have to resist Jeff Sessions and him deciding to come back at the community with the war on drugs.
Yeah.
When it's the white community that's addicted and in crisis.
I'm not disagreeing
But he's
with
talking about coming back at the community, and at some point, people have to stand up and challenge it.
Yeah, no. I'm not disagreeing with you. What I'm saying is it's a question of tactics. I totally agree with you that you're not going to change the anti-black bigotry. You're not going to change the anti-Semitism. You're not going to change the Muslim hatred. I mean, this has become ingrained for too many people.
Right.
But what you don't want to do, you want to be strategic though in your reaction. It seems to me, because you don't want to give them a platform to build their numbers.
Right.
That's the one thing.
And I would just suggest that, these awards, for example, the pushback on these monuments, I was sort of up in the air and didn't know exactly what I felt. I was like, some people suggested put a Frederick Douglass at every, Confederate monument to like a Jackie Robinson is at every baseball stadium. You know how Jackie Robinson's at every baseball stadium? Put a statue of Frederick Douglass wherever there's a Confederate, monument. Instead of dismantling them, contextualize the history so we can learn more. And I'm persuaded by that possibility. But I've also learned, just like Colin Kaepernick's protests expose the specific stanzas in our declaration, or in our, is it the declaration or the the national anthem, thank you, it exposed the racism, the explicit statements about black defeat in this pledge. In this way, these are monuments exposure have exposed for many of us the reality that they had very little to do with the 1860s and the Civil War, but have more to do with the assertion of Jim Crow terror. And as much as the noose represents something in American culture as it relates to African-American experience around 1910, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, up in between the interwar periods, so do these monuments. That's what these monuments represent. They're the equivalent of what the noose meant, because they were part of the same terror regime to come back to haunt Black America from 1896 to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education.
Can I make one point about this notion of terror?
Go ahead, Martin.
All right. Well, and I'm coming at this from the journalistic perspective. I'm going to have to take a class. But I think what also stands out here is the lack and unwillingness on the part of authorities to call this domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
Right. And what happened in Charlotte and actions like that and the increase of hate crimes since Donald Trump took office. And I also think that the other question then becomes, why doesn't that happen? So why isn't that happening more particularly in the journalistic conversation? And it's happening because law enforcement and public officials are reticent to call it domestic terrorism. And so for journalists, we are often then reticent to then draw that conclusion and to say, well, based on, because journalists, we're not supposed to make those kind of decisions, columnists can, but I just think the reason that it doesn't get classified and characterized and reported on in that way is because the law enforcement community is not calling it that. Well, and I would argue, I would just finish to say, is that I think that that needs to change. I think that journalists have to take a hard look at what is terrorism. And if it meets the same standard, there was a great story in the Washington Post, and I forgot the name of the writer who did it, but he reported on Charlottesville as it would have reported on had that incident occurred in foreign soil. And it basically was a terror attack. It was basically Barcelona, right, in Charlottesville. So why are journalists not calling it that?
Well, it's interesting that you raised that, Martin, because if you look at what happened this past week, ironically, Jeff Sessions actually did call it terrorism, where this whole week imploded for Trump was this. Correct me if I'm wrong. As I recall, it was a Tuesday and Wednesday at the press conference. It all started imploding when the questions started to ask, Mr. President, was this terrorism? Right. Because Sessions had already called it terrorism, and that's when we saw Trump's. Disintegration. It's disintegration number 2 of the week, right? While I agree with you, the irony is that this week actually,
they began to finally do it. But if you look at the numbers,
right? No, I totally agree with you.
It hasn't been done.
I totally agree with you. It's just it's an interesting byplay. This is what happens when you actually do raise the question with the president. He sort of came unglued, right?
And it's interesting, when you brought up the issues of the monuments and the statues, a lot of questions from you in the audience about that. Just want to read some of the comments. Could you address the fact that many or most of the Confederate monuments went up in the 1920s or later, and what that says about their meaning and purpose? And I think you got into that.
It was more about Jim Crow. It was more about terrorizing. Many were found outside the South. Whenever a black population migrated toward an area that was formerly largely white, the local white authorities would just put up these monuments to say, Negroes, this is a warning to you that this sentiment is supported here. And it was more like the old warnings, the sundown warnings. Don't let the sun go down on you, Negro, in this community. And that's what these monuments represent. And I think that's the beauty of now. That's the beauty of Colin Kaepernick. They're bringing up 19th century ghosts to show us that every day we're mimicking and reiterating these things and not understanding. And in the larger scheme, if we had the political wisdom on the scene, we would have to talk about reconstituting ourselves as a whole country, how to reconfigure and think about our social compact when we talk about citizenship and who's important in our society, and think about ways of, I think, just reimagining America in a new way based on a new contract and a new constitution of some sort that reflects more the diversity, the more current composite of what America is today.
Well, there are also several questions from the audience, and I'm going to make a composite out of them. But they're kind of picking up on this whole idea of, okay, so say you're a white liberal, pretend, and what can you do? What should you do? Whether it's you want to do something, but if you're saying is that that hardcore racist is not going to change their mind, then is the only policy basically to make sure that there is some state control to prevent them? I mean, what?
Well, I think the answer, is multifaceted. One in the most immediate sense, I do think there's a real strong place for demonstration, peaceful demonstration, not engaging, but showing numbers. I mean, the Women's March was January 21st, was incredibly powerful. And part two of that, that's the sort of thing that's called for at that level. The second part of it is very political, organizing and working through the political system and electing people who do not, like Trump does, basically say, go ahead, wink, wink, nod, nod. No problem down there. There's two sides to that debate. So there's a short-term issue and there's a long-term issue.
Well, I just think also too that, I don't know that people of color can tell white folks what to do to stop being racist. Right. And it's not our job, quite frankly. I think looking at it from the perspective of the systems that are in place, to me, the real racism that lies in this country and needs to be covered more greatly within journalism is the systemic. It's the institutional racism, right? It's the unconscious bias that we all hold. And I think that is the greater challenge to address in our society, because it is based upon what we are taught. Particularly, we in the media are complicit in shaping perception. There was a great study at the Joint Policy Center for Studies by Dr. Robert Entman back in 2006. It's like 11 years old, and yet it still is incredibly powerful and articulates how media images impact perception. And those images cause the perception that, for instance, that black folks have a gun in their hands when they don't. It's why police shoot first and ask questions later. So but these relationships also come in terms of how giving of healthcare, quality healthcare, as it relates to admissions and hiring and other social interactions. And so how do you address these deep-seated, from a journalistic perspective, my approach in the Maynard Institute's approach, which is our organization, is to train journalists to be aware of their own bias. We have a framework called the Fault Lines Framework that was Bob Maynard came up with. Some of you probably remember Bob Maynard. He owned the Oakland Tribune, first African-American to own a major metropolitan daily. And he talked about the fault lines of race, class, gender, generation, and geography. And that we all see the world through the prism of that. And how we align across the fault lines has a huge impact of how we see the world. And so we try and teach journalists to be aware of what your biases are, so that you think about who you talk to, you check your bias at the door, so that the stories that you can tell, the people that you approach, and the narratives that you weave are more reflective of the nuance of the people that you're talking to in our society. So it's a brick by brick situation. Unfortunately, I can't just drink a cappuccino and I'm good. But it's going to take time.
And I would just add quickly that I think liberalism itself is at an impasse in America, and has been, political liberalism anyway, has been at least since Ronald Reagan in 1980. And I think with Bill Clinton's election and Barack Obama's election, it solidifies the crisis of liberalism in terms of politics. And until you can find someone like a Bernie Sanders, who might be 10, 15, 20 years younger, who can present and package his, and I don't mean to be ageist as I say that, but just politically realistic, even though he did very well in his own body. But again, 4 years forward, 8 years forward, right. The Democrats have got to figure out, or liberals from whichever party, have got to figure out a voice and a position, a policy position that in some way echoes the idea that the common good is in our collective best interest. And I don't know how you talk about the welfare state and restructuring the welfare state in relationship to neoliberalism, but in other words, again, I may sound like an abstract academic, but I'm suggesting to us that we have got to talk about how to redo America, because America is already in flux and experiencing tremendous demographic and polarization changes. And if we don't manage it, it's going to manage itself.
Well, one way that, and this has kind of disturbed me from following. So after the Charlottesville, there was a lot of online finding out of who some of these people were and who had been marching, and so people kind of discovered who they were. A couple of them lost their jobs. But as part of that, people were like commenting, oh yes, I knew this person from class. They were always talking about X, Y, Z. And then they would talk about stuff that was on their Facebook page. And I think before that, people had kind of used the old line of, well, these are people who are, you know, they're attracted to the rebelliousness of it, the macho or whatever. It's like, no, actually, quite a few of these folks literally were attracted to gas chambers, the worst of the Nazi stuff.
Yeah.
And that, you know, to quote Barack Obama, who was quoting someone else, who was quoting, I mean, they're not born with those ideas. They're getting them from media, they're getting them from their parents, they're getting them from politics.
Yeah, and from other countries. To be fair, by the time this has finally come around to America with this Nazi phenomena, it had already been in Russia and East Germany and other parts of Europe in the last 15 to 20 years. Some of you may know this. And we've been given constant reportage about this phenomena in those countries.
Yeah.
And now it's finally come home, and we see the politics with Brexit and things in Germany and in, more accurately, France and elsewhere lining up to show, much like the 30s where we had this fascist moment in American political history, we have a kind of identifiable moment in which this sort of I think what Hofstadter calls it pseudo-conservatism, this fake conservatism that is something more hostile to real conservatism has emerged in our politics. We don't really have a liberal party, and we don't really have a conservative party in American politics anymore. We have a conservative party, which is the Democratic Party, and a confused party, which is the Republican Party, and then we have the right party, that is the right-wing party, that is the Trump-Bannon party in American politics now.
And I don't
We'll
think
get
it's
to
being
Bannon.
covered that way.
Sorry, Mark.
I was just saying I don't think it's being. I don't think the nuance of that distinction is being covered appropriately in media.
Thank you.
Just being real.
I'm just teasing.
Can I ask how many folks are planning on, hopefully not attending, but counter-protesting the rallies either in Berkeley or in San Francisco? Does anyone? Quite a few hands?
What are the choices?
So there's, well, okay, actually in San Francisco, there apparently is an effort to try to have a separate protest that would take place around City Hall. So I assume that's part of an attempt to try to bring the folks away to make sure that there's not, you know, violence and such. I don't know that will keep away the folks who want to go bash the other side. And Berkeley, is anyone from Berkeley who maybe knows? I assume they're going to try something. Do you have any insight on, is there a similar counter-protest plan?
Right, we're having something at the edge of campus.
Okay, at the edge of campus?
And I forget what street it is, but there's a big grassy area.
Okay,
It's about 4 or 5 blocks away.
okay, 4 or 5 blocks.
Really staying away from MLK Park. where
Yeah.
the Nazis.
So in Berkeley, too, there will be something a few blocks away, separate from the MLK Park. Actually, someone questioned, you know, why they're coming to San Francisco and Berkeley. I think it's similar issues of,
Why Charlottesville? Yeah.
They can get a rise.
liberal
They're not
college.
coming to downtown Oakland, I can tell you.
Austin, Atlanta, New York, liberal cities are the target cities.
well, and someone asked, are they not coming to Chicago because they think they would get a happier, a nicer reception in San Francisco than Chicago?
They are coming because they want to get it,
Yeah.
because they're coming to liberal bastions
Yeah.
where they know that they,
Yeah.
or they're hoping they will get a rise.
Yeah.
It's what they did in Berkeley a few months ago,
Yeah.
and Berkeley is, you know, some of them has been widely reported. It was a trial or testing ground, so to speak, for Charlottesville.
And in some ways, it paralyzes the liberal response because it doesn't know exactly how to react to this.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, what do we do? And, you know, how do we find our niche in this conversation? And that's part of, I think, some of the confusion that comes out of all of this chaos.
Well, let's kind of move to, if you will, a bit of the bloodless political aspect of this, and that meaning it sounds like I'm going from the real issues to kind of theater, and I don't mean it that way. But on the political side, the reaction to the president's press conference in particular on last Tuesday, CEOs began abandoning his manufacturing council. So many of them dropped out. He canceled it. He closed it. And I think there was another business council. His entire Arts and Humanities Council or committee or whatever they are resigned in a strongly worded letter. I don't know if you've seen it online, but if you take the first letter of each paragraph in the letter, it spells resist. So I don't think that was a mistake. It's true. So my question for you, and I'll start with you, Dan, on the far end. Do you think this has done damage to Trump, or is this more of just, it's another controversy he keeps going along, or is this stuff accretive?
Yeah, no. This has done real damage to him. There's no question about it. I don't think. Whether it's done damage with his base, it doesn't seem to have. Yeah. Apparently, according to some of the numbers, it's not clear. But within the Republican Party as a whole, and his ability to push his his legislative agenda, we'll see how much damage it actually does. But clearly, Republican members of Congress, mainstream Republican members of Congress, are clearly growing weary of this, and they are there and leery of this, and they're starting to stay away, and they're starting to actually speak out in some meaningful ways. And then the other thing is, as evidence of this, that even within the administration they're seeing this, was we just listened before this show started to Trump's speech on Afghanistan. But what did he do? He had to spend the first 5 to 7 minutes of it talking about the importance of unity. He's back before a teleprompter, by the way. And the importance of unity, so that the troops aren't coming back home to total chaos here. Which the notion that he has to do that is a testimonial to how bad things have gotten this past week. And how long that lasts remains to be seen, because once he gets back to his Twitter account from his teleprompter, anything could happen.
And I think that's the problem also when you talk about, from a coverage standpoint, but when you also talk about trying to seek to lead from a legislative standpoint, I don't see how you can see that he has any credibility at all. Because if someone tells you one thing and then 4 minutes later they go behind your back and tell you something else, or in this case, go on Twitter and tell you something else, I don't see how you can take what he is saying, clearly written by speechwriters, and then assume that is going to actually become policy, stay policy, be consistent. And so I don't know how the Republican leadership is going to manage this.
Well, the answer is that to the extent that the Republican leadership manages to do anything, okay, it's going to be in spite of him, not because of him. They do know that, if they push something through, he will sign it. Okay, and that's the difference from when Obama was in office. So that's the one thing they have going. But beyond that, the administration is no longer driving the debate. Right, but the administration will no longer drive the agenda.
Well, I would slightly disagree, only because that committed base to Trump is not discouraged by what happened last week with his response to Charlottesville. And about 63% of Republicans who were polled, I don't think that's all Republicans, but those who were polled happen to agree and support the president's response to Charlotte. 63% of Republicans polled in national polls support the president's response, where 63% of the country opposed it. And then in key states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, they opposed it, and the polls are dropping down 20-30% amongst working class white women, working class white men, the everyday American. Trump is losing support even amongst his base, but at the same time, he's been able to rely on that there's that red meat cultural dimension to his whole candidacy and administration that he connects with them on. So
Right.
as Trump can fail in every other area, as long as he holds on this cultural dimension of American politics, they will continue to support him. That's why, as much as complete chaos in American politics, as long as he got that race thing right last week, 63% of Republicans, the rest of America said, oh, hell no. The corporations said, oh, hell no. The Republican opinion respondents said, we support the president 63%.
Yeah, but he can't. Here's the problem, James. I agree with you in what you're saying, but he can't govern
Right.
from that position because there are too many Republicans in Congress who are in swing states or in more moderate, where they have to actually also talk to more than that 63% of that party, of that one party. They actually, to get elected, have to appeal beyond that. They have to actually come up with enough of a centrist message. There's a whole contingent, clearly, of Tea Party members in Congress who were there anyhow, and they're always going to be there. You're right on that, but I do think that his inability to break beyond that.
Yeah, but all these voter
hurts
suppression
his-
efforts that are going on in many states to
Absolutely.
disenfranchise people could lead to real problems.
And no question about that. But what I'm saying is, what you've got right now, what he needs to do to get his agenda through, is he needs to be able to he's got a Republican majority. He just has to be able to get them to coalesce. And there's some centrist Republicans who aren't going to coalesce around somebody.
This is the redemption of the Republican Party. If there is one, it is that there are principled Republicans like Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham and John McCain. The elders I've been saying since last year, the country needs those elder men and women who can come out and speak wisdom to us. They have come out, and I'm telling you, Mitt Romney, this week, I'm like, he is truly his father. He's become his father's son. He's become George Romney's son in representing his father's moderate liberalism.
Explain. Mitt Romney came out and demanded that President Trump apologize.
Right. And this is the position his father took here in San Francisco at the Cow Palace against Barry Goldwater in 1964 and walked out. To give us another possible way of being a Republican in America in post-1964, and nobody listened to him. They followed Goldwater, and Reagan repackaged it in 80, and now we have this thing that is an extension of his campaign of Make America Great Again.
Well, let's talk about this whole, what he can do politically and not, because this really walks right into our next topic area, which was the changeover in the White House staff. Steve Bannon, the chief strategist in the White House, was fired on Friday. Walked out, agreed to leave, however you want to say it. He was fired. And so I'm just curious on what you think that will play in whether or not Trump connects to his base, whether or not he is more or less effective dealing with, congressional Republicans.
Well, I can only speak based on what Bannon then said in the various interviews with Time and others. He was like, I've got all this knowledge after being in the White House for a while, and I'm going back to Breitbart, and it's about to be a frenzy. So, it actually I was sort of, I think some of the journalists I was talking with would be more pleased to have him stay in the Oval Office to a certain extent, because what can happen now is that he can unleash the beast through this vehicle. And we've seen how effective this kind of counter narrative can be in our society now. Folks, the way journalism and content has become to happen is that you have your own ability to sort of frame your own narrative around the world. The one thing that used to be beautiful about the front page of newspapers was that there was a little bit of what you needed to see, a little bit of what perhaps you didn't want to see, and a little bit of what you did not expect to see. And now that narrative can be shaped by your belief system. And I just think that he's going to go back, unleash attacks, and sort of continue. I just wonder if the new normal is going to be this journalistic siege that continues to fracture society, but that doesn't work to bring it together.
And see, I would add just a little bit to that, and that is the dimension of social movements, if that's what he sees his effort as, is that typically social movements, when they get what they want, they die. And I think in some ways, the election of Donald Trump undermines Breitbart's power and influence, even amongst the hard red right, the racist right. Trump gives them what Breitbart may have nursed. And now that the presidency and its historic power and this element have connected, what do they need with Breitbart? They got Trump. And I think Breitbart's going to find out the hard way that they were trying to use Breitbart to get to this kind of reality that they never expected. And now that they got it, they're not going to give up on Trump. The numbers show they're not abandoning Trump for this guy. Who is Bannon, Steve Bannon, outside of a journalist in terms of Donald Trump? Donald Trump, we know. Breitbart, we don't know.
I wouldn't call him a journalist.
A little bit of everything.
No, I wouldn't call him a journalist.
Well, and
Muckraker.
his role is either chairman or CEO. He's not.
He's not a journalist.
Dan, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Boy, do I hope you're right.
Right. And I think people don't appreciate that. And I said this on Channel 2 the other night. It's sort of like, in a real way, Donald Trump gives this element what Breitbart was aiming to. And so with Donald Trump's success, Breitbart thinks it can now pull that power away from Trump. Man, are you kidding me?
I don't know that.
They're in the Oval. I'm sorry to keep talking, but they're in the Oval Office. Why would they turn around to listen to you again after they got Trump?
Well, because there are other targets that I think Bannon he's articulated that he seeks to go after, right? Mm-hmm. The enemies of Trump. So
it's loyal opposition.
Right. To me, it's a propaganda machine more than it is he's trying to pull it away.
Okay.
But him going after enemies, I mean, a lot of the folks he's planning on going
That's true.
hashtag war
Yeah.
are Trump senior
His
advisors.
family. His family.
National
Right.
security,
Commissioner,
his family.
We could very well see sort of true internal warfare within the White House well, I mean, we've been having internal warfare within the White House, but within the party and how that plays out, I'm not quite clear. But what it doesn't do, coming back to your original question, clearly he had to start disassociating himself from Bannon and the likes, because yes, he's risking losing some of his base, but if he doesn't start showing some centrist sanity, if you will, he risks losing his whole agenda. He risks losing any ability to get anything done.
Well, so I think he did that the other day with this Charlottesville speech. I think, like Bannon said, the Trump presidency was over. And I'm one of the few people who argued that Barack Obama had a 2-year presidency effectively out of 8 years. I'm talking about all of the math. Basically, after November 2010, Barack Obama's presidency was effectively over. And Trump's is even shorter, more of a stillborn presidency. And I agree with you, all of these entanglements, both personal, financial, the problems of the Secret Service we're hearing about, all of the chaos of covering him and travel, the golf, all of this together, I think, really undermines his ability to carry out a political agenda. And if Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell were really prepared for this moment, we would see an era that in presidential politics we can study, especially studying Woodrow Wilson, of these ebbs and flows between powerful executive and powerful legislative interaction, a tug. And right now, with the president who's so distracted with these many distractions, now is the time for Republican leadership to assert itself around the policy agenda. But it can't, because they are divided amongst themselves.
And if you're the president and you desperately need, if you're going to get any legislative accomplishments, you're going to need Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell on your side. And he's just spent the last few weeks relentlessly picking on Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell is arguably the one most responsible for, in your terms, Barack Obama having a 2-year presidency.
Yeah, but let's be clear about something here. This is not an administration that has done nothing. This is not an administration that, administratively, he is, while we're all focusing on this, he's undoing environmental regulations. He's undoing social reforms. He's undoing educational. You name it. Mm-hmm. He is behind the scenes. We're talking about this, but let's be clear. He is unwinding.
No,
he is unwinding years and years of progressive progress.
Well, and that's largely because it wasn't indemnified under law, right? It was essentially executive orders because Obama couldn't get anything pushed through.
That's right. But he's not stopping there. Some of this stuff goes back multiple administrations.
Right. There are these categories in presidential politics called presidential styles and personality, how we study presidents and their personalities and their styles. And there's this combination of categories. One is active positive, active negative, passive positive, passive negative. And out of those combinations, the worst presidential form, the imperial presidents like Johnson and Nixon and maybe Bush in the Gulf War, would be the active negative president combination. The one who's aggressively engaging in his job or her job, but wakes up every morning with a negative worldview. And that's the worst kind of president you want. The best would be someone like John Kennedy, who has a healthy worldview, outlook toward the world, wakes up every morning and loves who he is in the mirror and loves America. That's the active positive president. Active negative is somebody that wakes up every day saying, who can I take an entitlement or a policy or a right from as president? And that's what some people I think in the long run are going to say about Donald Trump is he's the active negative president on something that makes people really bad.
Hyperactive negative president.
Yes. Good point. No, excellent statement. Excellent statement.
New Chief of Staff John Kelly has been credited with at least trying to put the control rods into the reactor. He's the one who fired Steve Bannon. He's the one who got rid of Anthony Scaramucci.
He wasn't very happy at the press conference the other day.
Well, and yes, he certainly thought it was going
He was looking down.
to be about infrastructure. How long do you think he's going to last?
Not long.
He's done a great job of managing the staff down.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody can manage Donald Trump. I naively study American presidency, assume that the office itself would discipline Donald Trump.
A lot of people
That
hope
office has not changed that man one bit in terms of his personality.
Yeah.
He has not behaved more, decorous. Is this the word decorously?
With more decorum.
With decor, thank you. With decor, he has not become more of our leading, statesperson. He's just Donald Trump.
He's not been humbled by the office.
And that's stunning when
And I
Obama
think-
and Truman say the office changed them.
Even Richard Nixon
okay.
said he was humbled when he first went into the Oval Office and realized, I'm the president and this is my office.
Well, this is why as a journalist, I just want to say this. As a journalist, I really loathe speaking declaratively politically often, right? We sort of more the context of what does the reporting say and how might the coverage be articulated. But there, at some point, through the preponderance of reporting, you can say with confidence a particular thing. Dan does this all the time in his columns, right? And I think based on Donald Trump's actions, his decorum, his decision making, his handling of himself, and that he is unfit to be president of the United States. I think that you cannot say that any other way. And that's not hyperbole. That is based on what we have seen as citizens and how he is approached.
I've said here 100 times, if Obama acted like Trump, I'm going to say this because I've hinted at it many times. I'm going to put it out there. The N-word would be what everybody would say is in play here. And I'm just being blunt with you as nicely as I can in this setting. They would say he's acting like you know what? Donald Trump is performing this in radical ways in terms of his conduct in the office. When Jesse ran in '88, when Jesse ran in '84, I'm old enough to remember everybody saying, what does Jesse want? What does Jesse want? Al Sharpton, these guys can't be taken seriously. Pat Buchanan, Sarah Palin, people like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond, no, they cannot have a stay at the table of mainstream America. And all of that went out the window. Just like Reagan and Nixon brought the politics of California's black power politics to office when they became presidents. In the 60s, they brought it there later, in the 60s and in the 80s, respectively. I'm arguing that Donald Trump has transported the racial politics of New York City to Washington, D.C. With Giuliani, Al Sharpton, Spike Lee, all of that politics of the 1990s, the cultural politics of the 1990s, are what we are now all giving a sample of as our national politics.
And John, let me come back to your original question on this because your original question was, is Kelly going to last? And frankly, this goes to both what James and Martin just said, which is there's such erratic behavior that I have no idea who's going to last and who's not, and I have no idea.
And
how
don't you think that speaks to fitness?
Well, yeah, I mean, but it speaks to, I don't know how this is going to play out. Because while there's certainly questions about fitness, there's certainly questions about temperament, there's certainly questions about leadership ability, on all these levels, there is no sign that there's anybody who could do something about this, i.e. the Republican majority, that's about to do that.
Right.
So I think, I said this before last time I was on this program, I think. Everybody's already talking about, impeachment and,
The 25th Amendment.
I'm sorry, but that's not in the near horizon, at least. And so how long does Kelly last? Kelly lasts as long as he can hold things together better than his predecessor was able to do.
Speaking of chaos, if you will, someone in the audience asks, business always wants stability. Trump is promulgating, instability.
Right.
Is that one of the key...
I think that it is. I mean, there was an op-ed by Julius Krein last week. He's the founding editor of American Affairs, and it's a pro-Trump quarterly that's been around for some time. And he said that in large part, his vision of the reason he supported Trump was because he thought that his ability to move an economic agenda forward, to not do nation building, to address the failings of the Democrats and Republicans over the last 20 years around foreign policy, focusing on economics and the like. And then, which was ironic to me. So I said, basically, the fact that he's a misogynist, that he was a racist, that he spoke horribly about women and people of color, didn't come across your fault line. Where it come across the fault line was class, right? Was economics, right? And so I guess however you get there, okay.
Right.
But he went on to say that he can no longer support Trump. And so I think that, as to your point, business, I think that could be the undoing for him, perhaps. Which is ironic considering he's touts himself as a businessman.
Well, Martin, he's the best businessman.
Yes.
Great.
Well, and there's been a lot of market optimism around the idea that he would engage in deregulation, et cetera. But
Well,
I
and
think,
they were expecting a
and he's
huge
still doing it.
infrastructure
right, but this is still Obama's economy, and I've
Right.
said this repeatedly. And I just think Trump wants to give Obama credit for the terrible healthcare program we have that's still with us, but not the great economy
Right.
that we have that he inherited just 6 months ago from the Obama policies. And there's nothing since 2009 that shows anything but a straight line of growth and development and economically that it was going to happen even if Mitt Romney had won against Obama. In his campaign, it was predicted that gas prices would be what they are no matter who was president, and much of the job performance would be what it is. But now that optimism that was around Trump is not as energetic, and with these recent resignations from the chair of Merck and everyone else that followed from Intel and Under Armour, this is the one area where Trump has sold to us that he's the man who can do deals and sell business to us in the country. And
Okay, but James,
Yeah.
why are these? Let's talk about these business people for just 1 second, okay? The reason these business people are peeling away is in part because they're personally disgusted. But the real thing that's driving them is it's going to start hurting their own business, okay? And that's why they're peeling away.
Right.
There's a wonderful New York Times piece about what went on behind the scenes, because these people, they were scared of Trump, but this was finally enough, okay? But at a certain point, they still want their economic agenda, and they still have to deal with the Republican Congress,
Well,
and they still, and really, so I think what their strategy is going to be is they're going to work with the Republican
Right.
Congress
To go down a
to
level.
try and get what they want, and anything that ends up on Donald's desk, he's
He's
going
gonna
to
sign.
sign
Right.
because and claim victory.
But this is one of the many reactions you're getting, like the ACLU. I guess we're going to talk about that if we get any time. But with the ACLU, you have different responses. The business sector, you have different segments of this country showing that democracy is still alive. And even after Trump's rant, it's the corporations that spoke up and said, we will not accept this. So that has to tell us something.
Yeah, it does tell
about the moment we're living in. That Trump is a force and his elements are a force, but so also is American democracy. And I think too often we give too much power to corruption and underestimate the potential of democracy in this country to fight back. And it is fighting back, it is resisting. And I think after all of this, we will be prouder being Americans after Trump than we are ashamed right now as Americans.
James, I don't think I was expecting optimism from you, but that's...
You just got it. That's about all you're ever going to get right there.
Well, so tax reform, we're not going to see it, right?
I don't know what we're going to see. I mean, I don't know what, here's the thing. I don't know why we don't see tax reform.
Yeah.
Frankly, because if you think of the paradigm I've been mentioning, which is really you don't need Trump for tax reform. All you need is for
Congress,
Republican Congress
Which
to be
is
able to
something
put
they
it together.
desperately want.
And if they can put it together, anything the Republican Congress can put together they're driving the agenda now.
Yeah.
Trump is no longer driving the agenda.
But there's such disagreement even amongst them. That
Well, that's the thing.
That's the problem.
But my point is, you don't write it off because of Trump. You might have to write it off because of the disunity in the Republican Party. Although I'm not sure there's the same strong disunity. We'll have to see.
Well, in the House, I think there was more than there would be.
Yeah, but over tax reform, as I think. As healthcare was, I think tax reform may not actually, to get some reform, may not be as tough as to get some change to Obamacare.
That's
because it's more complex, so it doesn't touch people's lives in quite. I'm saying politically, it's easy to slip stuff under, whereas with healthcare, people really engaged on that. They don't understand tax reform. I mean, to be blunt, it's being conducted at such a behind-the-scenes level that they may actually have something to claim.
Okay. Yeah. Don't worry, we'll have more news quiz questions and, of course, a lot more to talk about in September on the 25th. We'll be right here at the Commonwealth Club. Thank you to our panel, Dan Borenstein, Martin Reynolds, and Dr. James Taylor. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight and everyone watching and listening online. Have a great week.